Right now, it's time to check in with our enterprise fleet expert, Thomas Wasson, host of Loaded and Rolling and author of the Loaded and Rolling newsletter as well. Thomas, last week we were headed to the junkyard, and this week we're talking about autonomy, specifically down on that Sunbelt I-10 corridor, right? What you got for us?
So we have another study. It's study time, and I always am a big fan of trucking studies just because you don't see a lot of them. And so when you do see one, it's kind of like, hey, this is a big deal. So what we're looking at here is Carnegie Mellon and University of Michigan. I actually found this when I was doing consumer sentiment, so it just kind of worked out. But they talked about the impact of autonomous trucks on total operating hours. So what we mean by that is when they did this study, they took government data from a bunch of shipments, and then they took government data on hours to move these shipments by drivers. And what they found out was they wanted to ask the question, what happens with autonomous trucks if we have them deployed, and at what level will it impact drivers? And so there's a few interesting things and a few big takeaways. The biggest one is it depends on the weather. And so most people kind of laugh and they think, what do you mean it depends on the weather? Well, currently right now, Too Simple, a few other autonomous companies are testing along the Sunbelt. So they're going along areas that do not experience parts of America like you would in the game Oregon Trail, where instead of cholera, you have a tornado across Wyoming and it takes out your group. We still have that with wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour on I-80. And so the problem becomes when we look at the extent of disruption, will the weather impact it? Because it doesn't matter if a driver or not is on the truck, if the wind gusts are at excess of 70 miles per hour, it's still going to get knocked over. And so, good news and bad news. The good news is that if weather cannot be accommodated for, only 10% of total driving hours may be potentially automated or disrupted. The bad news is if they figure out how to, if you're the driver, for the companies, it's different. 40% of your costs are related to drivers. So 94% disruption. So this brings a very important question, which is, are we at 10%? Are we at 90%? And then also, what are the ramifications? So the model they examined is the one that's been reported on by FreightWaves and a few others. I think Ryder Systems and Georgia Tech, I think, did a study on it. It is called it's like a hub and spoke model, a transit hub model. Basically, for current deployment on autonomous vehicles, you're looking at a situation where driver picks up the load, goes to a terminal or truck port. I kid you not, they call it a truck port. This is real. And then the autonomous truck will pick up the load and take it across the highway. And then finally, it hands it off to another driver at the next truck port. And then that driver will navigate the suburban and urban sprawl to deliver it. Mm-hmm. So a little bit complicated, but it's pretty wild and there's a lot of ramifications.
So I'm putting my meteorologist hat on for this one because I think about the Sunbelt and people are traditionally like, oh yeah, this is great because the weather variations there aren't super huge. But then you look at it from a climatological perspective and it actually is pretty intense. You get some pretty rapid changes and the weather changes pretty quickly, especially along that I-10 corridor from southern New Mexico, from El Paso through Texas, through Midland, Odessa. You get some pretty wild storms out there. So this disruption that you can see with the weather, how are they accounting for that when it is pretty volatile, even though, like maybe 2/3 of the year is nice, but during that period where it's not, it's really volatile.
Well, how you do account for it, unfortunately, there's really one way to do it, which is you just got to drive a truck along it and see if it tips over or not. And so, that's why they're testing. You see a lot of testing along the Dallas-Houston corridor, San Antonio, Dallas, these areas in Texas. They're collecting the data and we're in the very early stages. The big question will be what happens if you go up large gradients, like going from let's say you start in California going up to Denver. That could be like 10 to 12,000 feet difference without a driver in there, and you're just going along interstate. So there's a lot of concerns with how that will impact. Now, most of these trucks, when you were doing autonomous stuff, they're gonna have LiDAR arrays. So you're gonna think like the LiDAR can go through and pretty much deal with rain and stuff.
Keep you straight, right?
Yeah, you can deal with rain and things. The big problem becomes severe weather events as well as icy conditions on the road, flooding conditions on the road. Mm-hmm. dealing with other drivers who aren't able to drive in conditions. There's a human factor, and that was in a previous study that the biggest concern as well is that you can make a really great self-driving truck, but as I've driven through in Chattanooga on the rush hour, the problem becomes it's not usually you, it's the other people.
Right, it's other people on the road. And so obviously there's a lot of worry about autonomy taking drivers' jobs, right? And when we're talking about autonomy, we're talking about it in those long haul cases where you're looking at, as you mentioned, kind of that hub and spoke model where they're existing on the interstate, they're existing in between these more complicated hubs. Do you think that we run the risk of drivers now having this kind of distaste with companies saying, you know what, we're going to replace you with an autonomous truck, but as soon as things start to get a little bit hairy, either with construction or traffic or weather, then we're going to say, no, come back and drive for us in these more extreme conditions?
That's a great question, and I think that the current stuff, especially if you're trying to become a new driver in the market, you're in a situation where you hear these news and you're like, am I going to get replaced? Well, the study has good news and bad news. The slightly good news is instead of millions of driver jobs lost, we're only going to have a few 100,000 potentially lost if we figure out the weather problem. So there is a slightly silver lining. It's a saccharine one. It's not fully sweet. But the bad news is that replacement jobs, you're thinking to yourself now, okay, well, Thomas just said there's a hub and spoke model. Let's just hire more people at the hubs. Yes and no, because the problem is those jobs traditionally, per the research, not me, I'm a trucking guy, I love trucks, they said the jobs are not very good, they're lower paid, and that you can't really replace them compared to the losses in over the road. And so the study recommends that there are definitely massive societal, geopolitical, and economic things to think about when we start testing this technology, because conversations will have to be had, like you said, on who gets to be the winners, who gets to be the losers, and how trucking companies will do it. Because when they interviewed the trucking carriers, most stakeholders are definitely interested in it. You're almost forced to as a carrier. You don't have the margins. 40% of your costs involve driver wages. You know, if you find a way to lower wages, it's nothing personal. It's just that's part of a very highly competitive freight market.
Right.
You know, it's a business, systemic business model issue, nothing against drivers. So very challenging to see how this is going to unfold.
And so you mentioned that if you're new getting into the industry, you're trying to be a driver breaking in. Do you think that this is now a good time as you're looking to the future of autonomy to hone kind of all of your skills and be more than just a long haul driver, right? You've got to be able to do multiple things now in the industry.
Correct. And I think now is always a good time to get in trucking and logistics, just because there's always job security. You need people to haul. But if you are a driver and you still want to become a driver, there's value in it. Because even in the event 10 or 20 years from now that we have fully autonomous ones, being a driver and understanding it, some of the greatest dispatchers I've worked with were former drivers. You have to have driven the truck to know what it's like. So when you got a person on the phone who's asking you these questions, you know, how do I do my DEF? How do I deal with these tire pressure issues? You know, how do I handle certain gradients? You do want to have an operator who's done it before.
Right.
And so there's always value in doing it, especially, you know, it's a very hard job, it's a very difficult job, but getting that information and then being able to rotate into other roles is always a wonderful first step.
Thomas, you're an enterprise fleet expert here at FreightWaves. We're looking ahead to our next virtual event already, the Enterprise Trucking Summit. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're excited about, hoping to get out of the summit?
Yeah, certainly. So definitely excited to have everybody show up. We're working on getting everything finalized, of course, but you know, getting discussion, getting visibility. Trucking is a very fragmented industry. Sometimes people don't like to talk to each other and share best practices. So any amount of information we can give to people who are operating on carriers, you know, it's valuable. Even if you're a broker or a shipper or anybody else involved in the supply chain, you want to have an idea of what's going on with trucking, because right now 70% of our stuff hauled domestically is on the back of a truck. So understanding that can really help you on all forms of it, even just enough to watch, come to the summit, check it out, learn a little bit about it, and there's value in it. Just like I really encourage people from trucking industries to understand what brokers and shippers go through, because if we all just knew a little bit more about some of the struggles we go through, it would involve me getting less yelling on the phone in my earlier career.
A little nicer to each other.
Exactly.
All right, Thomas, thank you for that. Head to live.freightwaves.com to go get registered for that virtual summit and the following one, the Net Zero Carbon Summit that's coming up on Earth Day of next month. We're going to take another quick break. We'll be back to start off your second hour of FreightWaves Now in just a few minutes.